Innuendo, Book 5 of the Todd Mills Mystery Series. Author R.D. Zimmerman. Publisher Scribble Pub Press, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Narrator Eric Aust. Chapter 19. With a knot wrenched so tight in his stomach that he felt he might vomit, Todd headed home, driving through a neighborhood that was dominated by clapboard houses with big Midwesternly front porches. He eventually came to the Lake of the Isles, which in truth wasn't much of a lake, but more of a sprawling pond, long ago dredged to Victorian scenic standards. He followed the single-lane parkway around the gently curving lake, past the Molto Mill mansion, a Dayton dwelling or two, then 3 mansions built at the turn of the century for the cream of wheat clan, oblivious of the couple strolling along in the cool air and not so much as glancing at the tranquil waters. Todd eventually came to Cedar Lake Parkway, where he turned, operating an automatic. He followed that and still another meandering parkway all the way to his condo. As he headed into the private drive that led up to the building's garage, he glanced at his watch and figured that he had about an hour and a half before he had to leave to meet with movie star Tim Chase, and about an hour and a half to get his shit together. Was he really going to be able to put on a happy face? Coming out of the closet had had one remarkable and undeniable effect on Todd. He no longer felt obligated to any kind of guy stereotype. When he'd been in the closet, he'd held back so very much, far more than just his sexuality, preventing family and friends from discovering his horrible truth had meant he had also prevented them from learning just about all his inner hopes and desires. And once he'd finally admitted to himself that he was gay, he liberated a great deal more than just his sexual orientation. Absolutely, once he'd broken the dam, so very much more than just his love of men had come bursting forward, like a good chunk of his personality. Not to mention his soul, and perhaps for that very reason, he now felt totally flooded with emotion. Yes, and he was drowning in confusion. If he were a crier, he'd be bawling right now. But he'd never been very good at that expression. His pain and tears for him being queer didn't automatically bring that benefit. So what in the name of God was he supposed to do? Beat his head against the wall? The answer came bouncing back. Honesty, you fool. That was all he'd been asking of Rawlings, and yet that wasn't at all what he himself had been dishing in return. No, he'd been making Rawlings feast on a bitter diet of Todd's own ruse, and as a consequence the both of them were getting more than a little queasy. Todd saw it now quite clearly that after a certain point he'd been just as deceptive as Rawlings, and there was no quicker way to poison any kind of relationship, gay or straight, business or platonic, than that, the withholding of information. Upon entering his 2-bedroom apartment, Todd passed the kitchen on his right, entered the living room, and crossed right to the balcony. He pulled inside the door, then stepped out into a day that was dying beautifully, the sky fading from blue to red to midnight blue. A cool wind, fresh from the plains of Canada, whirled around him, and he breathed it in, relishing it as a chilly aperitif of what was soon to come these ways. The great things in life were, if not impossible, then truly difficult to find, and yet he had found someone again. First there was Karen, then Michael, and now there was Rawlings. Somehow he had gotten that lucky enough to have found someone like both his ex-wife, Karen, and Michael, who had loved Todd even though he'd been in the closet, and now lucky enough to have found someone like Rawlings who loved him out. At this point in his life, Todd was too humble to think he was so great that love was destined to tumble his way, but he didn't know how he'd gotten so lucky either. He wasn't particularly religious, but having found these people was the one thing that really made him believe in a higher power, because God only knew he didn't deserve it. Or was Rawlings not a gift? Was he a trick or a curse? Something that was now beginning to come unraveled. Leaning on the balcony railing, he fell into that hole, gift or curse, and stood there for the longest time, pondering a question that had no answer, at least not yet. Eventually, girlfriend came sauntering out, rubbing against the railing, then peering, not out at the dark night waters, but straight down at the traffic below. When the black cat poked her head through the railing, followed by one paw and then another, Todd's stomach began to roll. No, Those cars, hundreds of feet down, were not little ants scurrying around. And no, this towering honeycomb of condos was not like a tree you could scamper up and down. Forgetting all about Rollins, he carefully grabbed the cat around her waist, pulled her back, then carried her inside. Besides, it was time to get ready, and he, for one, was going to take a shower, determined to wash the day and then that man out of his mind, at least for a few short hours. Parked on the street in front of Todd's building, Rollins didn't know what in the hell he should do. Go up to Todd's apartment or stay down here in his car. Of course, he wanted to do the first. Of course, he wanted to go up there and finish this off. This argument disguised as polite. Well, okay, so it wasn't so polite. A dinner discussion. Shit. It had been just like Todd to snap at him and storm away instead of finishing things off. That guy could be a real drama queen when he wanted. From his work in the media, he knew how to sensationalize the facts, how to focus on certain things to bring undue attention to one particular detail, and blow it out of proportion. Rollins just couldn't compete, and they both knew it. But what in the hell had Todd been talking about? A date? Shifting his seat, Rollins tugged at his mustache. Todd didn't know about Andrew, did he? He couldn't, could he? But then why all the strange questions? Why the odd mood? It was almost like Todd had been leading Rollins, trying to trick him into tipping a card or saying something inopportune. So what else was new? It was, however, exactly why Rollins didn't just head up to the condo right now. Because he was terrified. Todd somehow knew, and things would blow wide open. Of course, Todd was up there. Rollins knew that for a fact. After Todd had stormed out of the restaurant, Rollins had grabbed a carry-out box, dumped his pizza in it, and then charged out after him. By the time he'd gotten to the parking lot, however, Todd was just pulling into the street, not by any means unfamiliar with getaways. If this, in fact, was one, Rollins scrambled into his car, drove down the side street, and caught up with Todd, which had proved no difficult feat. As he tailed Todd around the northern end of Lake of the Isles, Rollins had soon discerned that Todd was going home. Yet instead of hurrying up and trying to get Todd to pull over, Rollins had kept his distance, letting one and then two cars slip in front of him. He could have even been very 90s and called from his car to Todd's, but he chose silence as the safest course. He wanted desperately to talk to Todd, but he was terrified of what they'd get into, specifically the subject of Andrew Lyman. Sitting in his parked car, he reached across the seat of the Taurus and flipped open the lid of the takeout box, and as if this truly were a stakeout, he started eating, only now it was designer pizza instead of donuts and coffee. His meal was only less than reasonably warm, and he gobbled down a single slice. In 2 or 3 bites, he was only halfway through a second slice when he licked his right fingertips clean and reached into the pocket of his leather jacket and pulled it out. Andrew's diary, that small spiral-bound notebook with a slick red cover. It was not something Rollins had been looking for, sex with Andrew or any other boy for that matter, but now this diary, and God only knew what else, were lying around like time bombs, waiting to go off and ruin Rollins' life and career. It wasn't merely that Rollins was more than 20 years older than Andrew either. No, that was far too simple. Just this afternoon, Rollins had reread the Minnesota statutes, and the very thing he'd feared had jumped right out at him. Criminal sexual conduct in the 3rd degree. Yes, Andrew had been at least 16, but less than 18, and Rollins was not only more than 48 months older, he was also in a position of authority. The allegations alone could ruin Rollins and set back by 10 years the progress gays and lesbians had made on the police force. He'd read only a line or two here and there, and he now opened the diary and thumbed through the first pages. There were pages about Andrew's trip to Minneapolis, how Jordy and he had hitchhiked there, what they found, where they stayed, things about his parents, and how he hated his father and never wanted to see him again. Then pages and pages about his relationship with Jordy, who seemed to want to control every aspect of Andrew's life. Rollins raced through it all, and then his eyes finally skidded to a stop when he saw the first mention of his own name written on the fine lines. There it was, as incriminating as possible. I had my first date with Steve Rawlings. He's a cop. He's got dark hair and beautiful eyes, and he's hairy. I think I'm in love. I mean big love, and what's so cool is that I think he likes me too. No, I'm sure of it. He took me out and paid and everything, and now he wants to see me again. I can't wait. I can't wait to have sex with him. I'm certain we will. I'm certain he wants me. That little shit, thought Rollins, that stupid little shit. That hadn't been a date. Yes, Andrew was enormously handsome. Yes, he had the body of a young god, and yes, Rawlins had noticed all of that. And then some, from his broad chest to his slim hips to the bulge in his jeans. But that hadn't been a date. Hell no. Rawlins hadn't taken him to lunch because he wanted to get in his pants. No, he'd taken him to lunch because he recognized a kid who needed help, who needed direction. He was a runaway, and he was a good kid, and Rawlins didn't want to see him flush his whole life away just because he was having trouble with his family over his sexuality. That was the whole ideal of being a mentor to a young gay person, the chance to offer advice and direction and support to a kid who couldn't get it anywhere else. But there was more about Geordie, lots more. They were living in a ratty old apartment along with 6 other young guys, and Geordie was becoming more demanding, more controlling. Andrew wrote how hard it was to get away from him, even for an hour or two. One night, Andrew went out with some other kids and snuck into a gay bar and danced and danced and danced, and Geordie went ballistic. It was shortly after that that Andrew took the job as the caretaker for the apartment buildings. I love Geordie, but I have to get away from him. He's just always in my face. He just never quits, never gives any space. Andrew then went on to write about his new apartment and how great it was. It was so cool, so great, his own place. Not that big, but wonderful. He was out of his closet and on his own. He was a real adult now. I had to do this. I had to break from Geordie when I told him I was moving out. He cried and cried, begged me not to go, begged me to let him come with me. I was really firm. I told him no. I said I just needed some space. He kept pushing, saying how much he loved me, that he couldn't let me go, and asking if there was someone else. I kind of just sort of said there was. That's when the shit hit the fan. He hit me, started beating on me, and I told him to stop, to get away. I punched him real hard, started screaming to leave me alone, to get away. I told him my new boyfriend was a cop, and he'd arrest Geordie if he so much as touched me again. Ah, fuck. Rawlins lowered the diary to his lap, sat there staring out the windshield. He forgot about the pizza, forgot about where he was, and he didn't see the dark night all around him. No, instead he was seeing it all so clearly for the first time. A setup. That was what it was. Andrew had been plotting and setting this thing up all along. How could Rawlins have been so stupid, so naive? Why hadn't he seen it in those dreamy blue eyes, all that want and lust? I'm in love. Big love. Rawlins took me out for lunch again, and we talked and talked. Right, we talked about your future, about going to law school. Or was your interest all bullshit? And I think I had a hard on the whole time. I brushed his arm, felt the fur there, the muscles. God, he just drives me crazy. He's just so butch. Rawlins, Rawlins, Rawlins. He's all I think about, all I dream about. I told him I have a diary, that I write everything in it, and I know he knows that I'm writing all about him. It's going to be so good, me and him. I can't wait to get in bed with him. I know he wants me to. I can see it in his eyes, sense it in his voice, hear it behind his words. Actually, I think it's going to happen tomorrow. I invited him over, told him I needed some help moving some furniture, but when he comes... Ah, shit, cursed Rawlins, throwing the diary on the seat next to him. One big lie, one big plot. How could Rawlins explain? How could he make anyone believe what had really happened? Yes, he'd gone over to Andrew's apartment all by himself, too, which had been stupid. He'd gone over there just hours before Andrew was killed. And yes, Andrew had been all over him, not just throwing himself into Rawlins' arms and kissing him, not just rubbing Rawlins' crotch, but dropping his pants and exposing his wildly lustful self. Ah, God, Rawlins had been such a fool, such an idiot. Why hadn't he seen it coming? And now what? Andrew hadn't been crazy, not by any means, no. He'd been a kid, lost and lonely, tossed out of his home and frightened, seeing Rawlins as some kind of hero, some kind of savior, and Rawlins now understood that. Just as he understood that Andrew's crush on him was just a desperate grab for something stable and secure in a world awash with confusion. He grabbed another piece of pizza, crammed it into his mouth, and started chomping down, bite after bite, without even tasting the artichoke. What should he do? He should go right up there, right up to Todd's apartment, and tell him the whole thing. At the least, it seemed as if Todd already suspected. So Rollins should just go up there and blurt it all out. I fucked up. I got myself into a bad situation, and I need the advice of the person I love more than anything or anyone else. Help me. Tell me what to do. Oh, God, how he loved Todd. He just didn't know how to describe it. The peace that he felt when they were together, or rather the peace he usually felt, but had not since the night Andrew was murdered. Ever since then, Rollins had felt as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to be pushed off. He gobbled the last bit of artichoke off the piece and tossed the crust back in the container. Yes, that was exactly what he had to do. Go right up there and, as his mother would say, have a good old-fashioned heart-to-heart. Todd would help him sort it out. Todd would tell him how to handle this, and then maybe they could start over. Maybe they could even go out for dinner again and get things right back on track. Or maybe they'd just have some wine and crawl into bed. Energized, Rollins checked himself in the mirror, then climbed out and hurried toward the glass lobby. He glanced up, wondered which lit window was Todd's, and he wondered, too, how far away they were from the next big step in their relationship. For Todd, who kept close track of his finances, that meant getting a joint checking account. But for Rollins, that meant moving in together. After all, wasn't sharing the same legal address about as close as a gay couple could come to getting married? He was just entering the glass doors when he saw a familiar vehicle come barreling down the driveway from the garage. Todd? Rollins was just about to dash outside when he caught a glimpse of him and noted right away that he got himself all slicked up. No, Todd couldn't have a date. He couldn't. He wouldn't do that to him. Really go out with some other guy? Or had that been why he'd been acting so weird tonight? It was as if he'd been punched in the gut and all the air knocked out of him. Rollins just stood there, his feet cemented into the floor, watching as Todd sped past the lobby, the house, the joint checking account. All of their hopes and plans whooshed through Rollins' head. Fuck, the bastard really did have a date. And then in a bitter rush of jealousy, he was pushing his way out the door, charging to the street and leaping into his car. He'd followed Todd here, and he damn well wasn't going to stop now. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.